I'm just putting my English tongue now.
No, dis nogal 'n adjustment.
Okay. Farming God's Way was founded in the early 1980s in the neighboring country where we are now, Zimbabwe, by a man called Brian Aldrieve. And Brian had a wonderful testimony on how he lost his farm and he had to look for a different job, getting work on a maize farm, and with a huge challenge on his shoulders. He's got to make a profit or he's out. It's not a charity, it should be a profitable business. Long story short, he made a big disaster on the maize production, and he was desperate, seeking the face of God, saying, Lord, what is happening? How can it be possible? And he just felt led by the Lord to spend intimate time with God in a forest. And there in that forest in Zimbabwe, God revealed the most amazing technique to Brian. And it all started by God telling Brian, have a look over there in the field where you are farming. How does it differ from here where I am farming? And he started seeing there's such a big difference. Firstly, he saw that they were plowing, they were inverting the soil. They used a process called tillage, and it was to such an extent that the whole character of the soil, as God has created it, was just turned upside down. We see in nature God is not plowing, so we will not plow. We will see what God is doing in nature and we will emulate Him. We will follow His ways. Brian was shown by the Lord in the forest that every here and there the plants grows, and most probably the seed to ground contact is reached when the sharp hooves of antelope and animals actually pushes the seed into the ground. So we should do the same. We should make planting stations, holing it out with a hoe, and there we will put our inputs. We are sitting in a forestry area right at the moment, and at my feet is a thick mulch cover. We call it God's blanket. What a wonderful name. God has placed a blanket on His creation. He's protecting the ground and the organic and biological activity in the ground with a blanket, protecting them from the excruciating temperatures, protecting them from rain, protecting the moisture in the ground from evaporation. If God has placed a thick mulch cover on the surface of the earth, we should do the same. God has shown us in nature that we don't need all the super expensive implements and mechanized methods to have a proper farming area. God has shown us that we do not need the most expensive irrigation systems. He's the expert in irrigation. He sends us enough rain, even in the dry, arid areas. By applying God's blanket and faithfully maintaining God's blanket, we will preserve all the moisture that God gives us, and that will be enough for good germination. We will be planting in straight rows. We teach the people to lay out a field with beautiful 90-degree corners, so that when you look at the field, you would say, wow, great standards to the glory of God. That's the pleasure that we have, applying these principles, standing back, being faithful, but standing back and see God appearing and seeing God manifest on the lands of the people. And that's the wonderful way how God just turned around the character of the ground that has previously been labeled as poor and unfruitful. We see with our own eyes how the biological activity just returned. Single days after the method has been applied, we see the insects returning to the ground. And that's what we have the privilege, the divine privilege of doing, is leading people through the principles of farming God's way, to turn from the old ways, maybe old ways of culture, of history, maybe farming like my father did or my grandfather did, with the most respect to those people, but evaluating those principles that we were used to and comparing them to the blueprint of Jesus Christ and seeing, wow, it really differs a lot. And then make the big step in faith by trusting God to do what He is so able to do. What a privilege to see the glory of God manifest when we apply the methods that God has given us.